Today's guest on the Keto and Yoga podcast is Kate O'Donnell. Kate is both a long-term practitioner of Ashtanga Yoga as well as a trained Ayurvedic consultant. However, Kate didn't take Ayurveda simply because it's a trendy thing to do, as it is these days. Instead, Kate's involvement with Ayurveda came from a personal health crisis that led her to this ancient science of healing as a patient. So having left when she was 20 to work as an English teacher in India, she ended up in Auroville, South India, and staying for extended periods of time, she contracted gastric parasites, which I don't recommend to anyone. And so over the next years, in fact, she struggles with serious health complaints, primarily when she was studying then with Sharath Jois in Mysore, India. So, as she mentions in the podcast, one day she was so ill in Mysore, she was so ill with the gastric parasites, her friends bundled her into the back of a rickshaw and sent her to the local Ayurvedic doctor, at which point she never actually looked back. After going through the Panchakarma treatments, a 5-stage cleansing process, she emerged a new person in all respects, and she describes a period of deeply transformative experiences. At this point, her life course changed forever. Ayurveda, often called the sister science of yoga, treats patients with asana as well as a range of therapies and dietary advice. Based on the Samkhya philosophy, similar to yoga, it aims at manipulating or resolving the problem of the gunas, the material energies of the world that are unbalanced. So as yoga does it for the purpose of spiritual transformation, Ayurveda, the difference is it does it for material or physical health transformation of the body. So, don't worry, we're going to get around to diagnosing our dosha over the course of this episode, so make sure you listen to the end. Kate is the author of 3 cookbooks and a founder of the Ayurvedic Living Institute. She regularly teaches courses at the world-renowned Cripple U Center on the east coast of the US. You can find her at kateodonnell.yoga.com. As always, let us know what you think. Don't forget to review us on iTunes and donate if you fancy over a website with buy us a coffee, or 3 if you fancy. Also, head over to YouTube where you can find loads of episodes, including this one, and all kinds of stuff over there that we're working on now. So without further ado, welcome Kate to the Keto and Yoga podcast. So, welcome Kate O'Donnell to the Keto and Yoga podcast. Thanks for coming on. It's lovely to have you today.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I've heard about you for many years, actually. And I didn't know until recently that you're an Ayurvedic specialist. Or can you say you're a doctor? An Ayurvedic doctor?
No, I'm an Ayurvedic practitioner.
No. A practitioner,
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, you don't want to make any grandiose claims there.
Exactly.
But I'm just, yeah. Other people say, well, says he's a doctor, and you can't give advice, all that kind of thing. Right? You get that a lot. No, you've got to qualify that. You're not a real medical doctor. Anyway, I'm really a fan of Ayurveda, and I think specifically because it was always said to be, I think, the two wings of a bird, like for yoga and Ayurveda, a sister science to yoga. And in fact, I mean, there's a text, isn't there? Yoga Charika. How is it said? That's the fundamental text of Ayurveda.
Charaka.
I can't remember. Charaka. Oh, I was almost there. I should have just gone through with it. The Yoga Charaka. And I think Jason Birch did translation, which I was reading recently. And it's very much framed that yoga and Ayurveda are very much framed together as a kind of, complementary or as a healing modality. Do you want to just open to say a little bit about how yoga and Ayurveda might complement each other and lead to similar or differing conclusions? Yeah.
Sure. For me, I've started to really learn more about philosophy actually when I studied Ayurveda. That's when I really learned the Samkhya more deeply, because everything, the whole substratum for the tangible universe is at that bottom right corner of the Charaka with the 5 elements. And so to be able to trace it back, to Purusha and Prakriti, which I had learned about through my yoga, everything came together for me when I started to learn the two together. And where one of the places I always got hung up with my yoga studies was there's yogis and there's householders. There's people who are sort of living a renunciant life. And I felt like the yoga texts that I was studying, even like Patanjali and even Patabi Joyce's book. It was very confusing for me as a young person. I was like in my early 20s reading these things, where it's like, don't socialize, don't eat too many vegetables, and I didn't have any context for
or if you're going to
understanding.
eat a lot of snake gourd or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Yeah. Put your cow dung on the floor. Yeah.
And none of it made
not the most
sense.
not the most practical instructions. Yeah, absolutely.
Right. And then I started to learn, Ayurveda, and it was like, oh, okay, instead of doing salt water enema, I could take Triphala, or there's other more sort of moderate actions that I could do that are cleansing or nourishing to the body, depending on what is needed. And it felt to me sort of like the sciences are philosophically have the same basis, except yoga is very much the study of evolution of consciousness. And Ayurveda was very much the study of maintaining the energy and physical bodies for longevity purposes so that you had more time and less distraction to actually do yoga.
Yeah. And also to kind of like to balance the effects of yoga. Have you come across that idea before, that the yoga is kind of stimulating? It can be overly stimulating, and Ayurveda kind of just keeps a lid on that, so it doesn't become you don't become overwrought. Maybe
that was true for me. Yeah, I never learned that,
right.
anywhere from anyone, but that was true for me.
No, I think it's true. I think it's true for a hell of a lot of Ashtanga students out there who generally, a certain kind of constitution, which maybe we'll come back to in a second. Don't want to become too cliche and say, it's all Vata, everything's Vata, but there's certainly a lot of that around, and the Ashtanga, I think we can safely say, can aggravate that propensity sometimes. But I wanted to also, I was kind of listening to a few things you've done, and as one does when having to research naturally, and you mentioned a lot of health complaints that you were having. So I suppose I'd like to practically first of all flesh out your journey with Ashtanga and your own practices and coming to India and getting quite sick. I think you got pretty sick a couple of times, right? And how that led to an experiential kind of need for this, rather than just, what should I do now? Oh, it seems an obvious idea. I'll study Ayurveda, right? I practice yoga. But I think for you, it was, there was a real need to do so. As I understood, you were really quite unwell, right?
Right. I spent a lot of time in India early on. So at 19, I went to Oroville, the intentional community, just south of Chennai. And I was teaching English there at a village school and really kind of living pretty closely to the land. And that, I think, that was part of how I got so sick. And I got all sorts of different...
Too closely to the land.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So it just all sorts of intestinal parasitic infections. And I was really taken with India immediately. I've wanted to go there since I was a little girl. So it was, as soon as I hit the soil there, I was just never looked back. So I was back and forth to India about, once a year or every other year. And I think it was that second trip. So I'd had the parasites going on already for over a year, and things were really bad. I don't know that I would have survived actually without medicine, And
really?
Yeah.
That bad. What were the kind of symptoms? If you don't mind me asking, if they're not too intrusive.
No, I mean, it was, the obvious digestive stuff had turned to, I think that the parasites had penetrated my lymphatic system. And so it was like all my lymphs were very swollen. And every time I ate, they would get worse. So it was like just hard lumps, in my groin and in my armpits, and like really intense bloating. And again, I was really young. So I don't know what was going on, but once I started, and it was hard at that time to find anyone in America when I was back in the US. Nobody knew anything about what was going on with me. So I could, all I could do was take a broad spectrum antibiotic at that time, which I did after that first year. And then there's the process of rehabilitating from that, from taking Flagyl, which I don't think they even use anymore. The travelers from, 20, 25 years ago will remember Flagyl, though. That was what they'd give you when you...
Sounds nice. Right.
Yeah, you come home from India. Yeah. So when I went back to India later...
It just knocks everything out, does it?
It does, like everything. Yeah, just everything. And so when I got back to India after that, everything went nuts. And I was in Mysore, and somebody sent me to Dr. Anil Kumar, who I think a lot of listeners who've been to Mysore will have heard of, Dr. Kumar. He actually had an office in Gokulam for a while. And I didn't know anything. I was just kind of like, somebody put me in the back of a rickshaw and like sent me there. I did not know anything about Ayurveda or anything. They were just like, here's a doctor, and I just did everything that he told me to do. I did a Panchakarma at the Aditya Ayurveda Hospital right there on Contour Road. And it just changed everything for me. It changed my relationship to reality. It changed my ability to understand reality. And that was not what I was expecting. I was just kind of trying to like get my digestion back.
Yeah, that's a pretty intense thing to say. I mean, pretty extreme kind of shit. Like, I mean, yeah, how so?
It was like, first of all, I think to receive medical care where you have no idea what's going on there's a certain amount of surrender that happens there, that I was undergoing, like sort of invasive things, like having like people give me enemas, things like that. You're naked on this wood table, like covered in milk. It was just all this kind of wacky.
Okay, well, that could be life changing. Yeah, I can see that. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. But what happened was that when I had the actual like cleansing moment, so you do all of this preparatory procedure in order to get the things that need to leave the body. You sort of bring them, you centralize them to the digestive tract, and then you do some sort of a purge, And so it was after that purge that it was like the veil between the physical and the subtle realms just became very thin. Because I think my physical body had been altered, in such a intense way in such a short moment of time. It was like a 24-hour period, and my body was not the same. I was, I think, more attuned to the subtle body than the physical body, just because that was more available. Because my physical body was like someone else's body, that was unfamiliar to me. And so I was just like, I was sort of communicating with, it felt to me like subtle ways of knowing, instead of how we usually kind of filter our experience through our sense organs and our physical body and the ego, the ahamkar, like Kate O'Donnell is this and does that and knows this and thinks that way. All of that was removed. And
how long did that experience last?
Oh, it was, I would say, the very intense, like, angels singing kind of thing was like, that was like an hour,
10
that
minutes.
was very,
right,
yeah,
okay,
exactly.
Okay. But yeah,
exactly.
But it had a dramatic effect on you. I suppose my second question is, what do people have to, do all people have to go through the Panchakarma? I mean, you hear a lot, when you hear of Ayurveda, you often hear of Panchakarma in the same breath, but, obviously you were very ill and you did it. And for an everyday person who perhaps isn't suffering, so chronically with parasites, etc., is this necessary? And what are the basic, just to get on a practical kind of bent again, where it doesn't involve necessarily enemas or puking up or or anything else. What kind of basic principles might people start operating from in Ayurveda? And I suppose a subsidiary to that question is, look, do you need, you hear of this Panchakarma, this purging, do you really need that, or is there, more kind of gentle ways to go about it, that people might practically do without going to India and being slathered in oil or milk and put on a wooden table and
Right.
God knows what else.
Right. Yeah. I mean, so the disease process and the way it's described in the Ayurveda text is there's 6 different levels. So you can be working, at the earlier stages, like the first 3 stages of disease, where you're just having like early signs and symptoms. And then those symptoms become aggravated and start to affect your ability to do daily life. And then the problem in the 3rd stage starts to spread, usually via the bloodstream. And I think a lot of people are in that place now with sort of systemic inflammation. That's become such a big thing. And it's like once you get past that, then the problems start to lodge in your tissues. And that's when Panchakarma might be necessary. But we have the whole first volume of the text is just about prevention of getting to the point where you might need that, So it's, so much about the text where it discusses, the different ways of using food, the different things to do at different times of day, like all that stuff that I think of them as sort of dinacharya, like general daily routines that we can follow, which are so great for Ashtangis because they love routine, and it just like goes very hand in hand, all of that. So I think Panchakarma is, it is like the jewel of Ayurvedic medicine. But the way I like to talk about that is like, don't play that card until you need it.
Right.
I think a lot of people.
How do you know whether you need it or not? They want to go in. That's an intensity, isn't it? It's like, let's do Panchakarma.
And I think, Ashtanga students tend to be intense people. And so they want to think like, I'm going to go all the way.
Exactly.
I'm going to go all the way.
Yeah, I'm going to do it. Yeah. It'd be better if I do more of it. Yeah,
exactly.
But I mean, how do you know whether you're really at that point when you need that, or whether you might just sensibly change your diet and change the way you live your life, and that might be okay, right? And I suppose again, a qualifier of that question is can you do it outside? I mean, are there centres now within Europe that are doing Panchakarma, or US, right? I mean, the places that people can find to do these as well, right? I don't know much about that.
There certainly are. So I would look for a place that's been around for at least a decade. Because new things popping up, like it's harder to know, that person has a lot of experience or training. But you don't have to go to India to do Panchakarma. That's for sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And I think it's important to integrate some of the daily diet and lifestyle regimens before doing Panchakarma anyway. And so if one is feeling like something's wrong with the health, and you're already integrating these routines, like you've already changed your diet, and you're already kind of like sleeping at the right time and eating at the right time, but you still feel sick, that's probably when, you might need to go to deeper measures. And it's important to me, before people undergo Panchakarma, that they have established healthy routines that they're going to go back to after. Or else that's problematic. That's problematic to cause this kind of change in the tissue of the body and then like go eat hot dogs and Twinkies. Like that's really going to make problems.
What is it? I've heard of Twinkies. What is a Twinkie? Is it a pretzel of sorts, right?
No, it's like a pastry, like a highly
processed.
It's a pastry, is it? A sponge
really?
cake. Yeah,
a Twinkie.
Like a
right, okay. That sounds nice. That's a great name. Right, so what going back on track, what are these lifestyle changes that you might suggest? Because we hear a lot, I mean, and also the obvious thing about the food, right? I mean, we hear all this stuff about eating loads of ghee and dairy and then that that stuff, as I mentioned in the Yoga Mala, doesn't really help about eat this. Is it do eat snake gourd or don't eat snake gourd, or there's a few kind of perhaps bizarre suggestions as to what someone should eat when practicing yoga. What does a daily lifestyle kind of look like for the practitioner? And is it that we have to eat a lot of dairy to especially with the current situation with the processed dairy industry, right? Are there other alternatives for people that don't eat dairy, or is it a question of finding the best dairy you can?
Ooh, yeah, right. So
That's
there's
it, really.
two things going on
Yeah.
there, right? One is like, what's the daily regimen? The other is like
Yeah.
then we
How does
have
it
the
involve
dairy
food? Yeah,
question. Because
exactly.
Batabi Joyce used to tell
And
people,
sorry, there's 3 questions even. Yeah.
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 And Ayurveda does love dairy, so we can definitely address that. But so I feel like, Adam, on your podcast, I can kind of talk to Ashtanga people, right, as opposed to like the general public. When I speak as though I'm speaking with people who do Ashtanga, I maybe talk a little differently.
Yeah, right. I mean, I want to open up the debate. That's the whole idea of the podcast, to open up the debate to more than just Ashtanga students, But, primarily, probably, we can say we're still mainly talking to Ashtanga students, yes.
So, anyway, the yoga people tend to kind of get up a little earlier anyway, right? And do the practice. So the idea is, with the daily regimen, we're looking at the changes that the elements are undergoing based on the movements of the sun, in a 24-hour cycle. And so when the sun is highest, there's more of that fire element in the environment, and that's mirrored in the human body. So there's more fire element at midday, right? So like, it's not great to practice and do a hot exercise thing in the middle of the day because it's already hot, right? So it's a great time. It's a good time when there's that kind of heat.
Seems like a good time to do it.
Well, yeah, I know what you mean. Well, so we're always looking to balance the qualities that are naturally present in the environment. We're looking to bring in sort of opposite qualities at that time, so things don't get top heavy in any certain direction, right? So it's that midday time is like the ideal time to eat food, because that Agni, that fire principle, that's the digestive fire. So that's like strongest. It's having a little like party at midday because that's when the sun is highest. And so we have this routine around eating the biggest meal at lunchtime, which works, I think, for a lot of people who are up early doing practice and whatever. So like daily regimen would be, okay, you try to get up close to the sunrise. If you want to do spiritual practice, the ideal time for that is that Brahma Muhurta, 2 to 3 hours before the sunrise. That's when all your puja goes down and you're chanting and your pranayama and all this business. And I think it is a good time for practice or study. And then, so when one is waking up, there's the tongue scraping, which is just such an excellent, easy, fast routine that so many people can do, right? And it's just, you just take a copper or a stainless tongue scraper. And the reason for that is because a lot of the dinacharya practices are about purification. So the body is sort of, while you're sleeping, the body is cleaning house, which is, it's like, that's why we tend to not eat a big dinner, because then your digestion can be resting, and instead the liver is kind of cooking junk out of the blood. And so all of that stuff the body wants to get rid of is coming towards the ends of the mahashrota, or the digestive tract. So your mouth and your anus. So when you got up, you scrape the tongue because there's going to be like mucus there, and you remove that mucus rather than like put it back down into the stomach, which that's so easy and
so
fast.
You can just get like a tongue scraper, can you? You Google tongue scraper and buy one for people. Or could you use a toothbrush or something like that?
Not the same.
You have to have
not
a copper.
The same.
Right, okay, you need a copper thing.
Yeah. Yeah, and the
I think in
toothbrush
practical terms, what happens if you can't? Right, it won't do it. Okay, forget that suggestion, everyone. Just use that copper tongue scraper thing. Get it. What happens if, practically speaking, you're unable to eat your main meal at midday? I mean, like it used to be the case that everyone had that time off, and certainly in southern Mediterranean countries, you have this ritual of eating, like your main meal and having, hours of siesta or whatever off work. But, that's becoming less and less these days, right? That people are unable to do that. I mean, do you have any advice for people that still need to eat that, main meal in the evening, right? So say, because otherwise you could kind of think, oh, well, this is not for me. I can't do that, so forget it. Do you know what I mean?
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, which it's always better to sort of understand the traditional value, why they're saying that things are this way, and then modify as necessary with an understanding of why things are happening when they're happening. And then you can shift it, So like, I think in a lot of the Mediterranean countries, especially where there's a very warm season, you don't actually have an appetite at midday. It's actually too hot. So you might eat once the sun goes down, because it's cool once it cools down. And so I think a late morning meal and an evening meal, great. And then that whole midday time is just digestion. That's kind of another routine, another way of working it that can happen.
Right. Okay.
What I think a lot of people do, Adam, is they avoid eating all day long because they're working and they don't want to get tired or distracted. And so they're in their most active time all day long. And then they collapse onto this huge dinner at the end of the day. And that's not helpful.
That's not good.
It's not good,
Right, okay.
So they could still have that meal, but maybe try to make an effort to eat a smaller breakfast and a smaller lunch, and then make that dinner less of an event.
Less large. That's kind of what I do too much, I think. Yeah. I mean, I think to argue my corner, I think if depends on how much you've digested during the day already and how, kind of how hungry you are as well.
Right.
But yeah, I do understand that it's probably better to eat early in the day. I should do that more. I mean, and what about the food? I mean, the actual food that is suggested, right? And how then does the obvious doshas thing with the Ayurveda? If everyone knows something about Ayurveda, it's generally this, Vata, Pitta, Kapha stuff going on with it, right? And self-diagnosis obviously is rampant, probably irritates the hell out of you. Give me any basic guidelines for people in terms of, I know that we're in, rocky territory offering any kind of guidelines, as I've done many podcasts on food, and generally they are very commentful, let's say, but and you just with a disclaimer that Kate is not offering any kind of serious guidelines for you. I mean, what does Ayurveda say about about the doshas and eating
and food
and dairy?
Yes. Just back to that dairy one, right? The dairy it has naturally occurring fat. And it's sort of one of the more fatty substances. It's a very nourishing, sort of rich and cool at the same time. So when you do a lot of yoga, especially pranayama or advanced postures, you are creating a lot of heat in the system, specifically in the nerves. We're running energy through the nerves on purpose. We do that as a tonification, right? And people think Ashtanga is crazy, but if done correctly, slowly, it can be very beneficial to strengthen the nervous system. But on a physical level, you need to buffer that, right? That needs to be buffered by fats. Fat makes up your myelin sheath. Your spinal cord is housed in this sort of fatty liquid that is also cool, in order to balance the fact that nervous energy is hot. It's the energy that runs through the nerves is hot. It's heating, it's friction, activity. And so when we put in cool fat, the body just loves that. And that's why I think in Ashtanga you hear all this about ghee and dairy. And ghee has an affinity for the nervous system. So ghee is butter that's had the milk solids cooked out of it. People can make it at home pretty easy. And that way, the very difficult part of the fat, of the dairy fat, has been removed. So a lot of the preparations in Ayurvedic diet, we actually have removed the very hard to digest parts of the fat.
Is that the hard bit? Right. That solids, that milk solids, that's the hard bit, is it? That's the bit I like.
Right.
So you're wrong. Yeah, that's the.
Well,
I
you might
remove
need
that bit. It's kind of nutty, and I like that. I like that bit. And it sounds a bit like when you talk about heating and cooling properties. It sounds a bit like macrobiotics, which I know a lot more about. Right? I mean, is there any kind of basis, structurally, to say that you're using food in Ayurveda as along those lines and heating, cooling principles in terms of looking for some kind of methodology around how to self-diagnose in a way if people are thinking, what should I eat? And should I eat the dairy or not? And
Right, right. Yeah, in Ayurveda, the ultimate potency of a substance is whether it is heating or cooling. So we look at that quite a bit, and if somebody is say what we call a Vata type, they run cold. So we are looking to introduce more warming substances for them. Or your Pitta type, a lot of Ashtangas tend to be Pitta types. That's the fire principle. So these people, they tend to overheat. And so we're always introducing cooling substances. And those are the ones where milk is especially helpful.
Right. What? How do we diagnose, or how do we kind of understand what's a heating, what's a cooling? I mean, it seems kind of self-explanatory to say milk and dairy is kind of cooling, but I suppose the heating thing is the spices mainly, right? And the ginger. And I mean, is there any way that people can understand for themselves, and kind of figure it out? Like, oh, this is cooling, this is heating. I mean, like you talk a lot about the khichadis and the dals, right? I think are a big basis for Ayurveda. I mean, are some dals heating and some cooling, or yeah? Sure,
yeah. So some things are easy and obvious, and other things would require more study. But one of the things I recommend, I'm always telling people to just be a mad scientist. And not to just try to do it right, but to actually get in there with the substances and just get crazy. And if you eat a lot of a substance, you eat it by itself and you eat a little too much of it, you can actually figure it out.
Yeah.
Like papaya is a great example.
Right.
People tend to think, oh, it's so refreshing and blah, blah, blah. But papaya is intensely heating. If you overeat it, it will give you hot, loose poop. Right. So anything that gives you like a sort of an acrid, loose stool is probably heating. Like if you eat a bunch of tomatoes or, as you say, spicy food, anything that's acidic is probably going to be heating. And then things that are cool are usually the ones that are they're softer, like a cucumber. Or your bottle gourd, these things that are very watery.
How do you know
soft.
whether? Yeah. How do you know? I mean, apart from the stools, I mean, is there some other aspects you can kind of figure out on your body, or is it or should one particularly look at emotions? Poo more often. I mean, do you look at
yeah, poop talk is huge.
So being very polite now, very English here, right? Is it?
Yeah.
Right.
You'll hear in around here they'll say, what is your poo telling you? So when you look at the stool, it might be dry, and that means there's a dry thing going on, right? Like the poop is hard and dry, and so there's dryness in the body.
Yeah.
Which you could notice also in your skin.
And then what would you do to
hair.
counter that? Right.
You would take some oily substances. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Whether it's from dairy or from nuts, or even from meats. Ayurveda is not a vegetarian system.
Really?
It's not.
I think that's probably a misnomer then, because right. Most people I think it is. Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
I thought it was, in fact.
Yeah, no, there's a whole chapter about the different energetics of all the animal foods and all the different groupings of animals, and how they are medicinal. But I think the difference is that meat is not a part of your daily diet. It's like if there is something that needs to be remedied and meat can be used, then, it's cooked into some kind of preparation. But nobody's sitting down with a steak. It's not that kind of thing. Yeah,
it's more like it's used as medically rather than just like I really fancy a burger right now.
Right.
I mean, what does okay? So and then loose. Like if you have a loose stool, what does that signify? You need more hard cooling things.
Cooling and calming. It's like the digestion's overactive.
Right.
So we need to calm it down.
Right, okay.
And sometimes there's actually too much oil at play there. And so you can see if the stool is oily, you'll see an oil slick going on. And then that often happens if you eat fried food, obvious stuff. So if, the stool gets hot like that, that'll happen if you overeat spicy food. A lot of people think like the Indian restaurant is Ayurvedic food, but it's not. It's usually very spicy.
It's a nice idea, isn't it? Yeah. I mean, that's a nice. Yeah. It's one thing that we might like to think when we're eating a nice biryani or something.
Right.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
So it's all Ayurvedic or Thali. What I'm very. It's not too personal, but what does your diet look like? I mean, how do you cook? And and for people that don't have a bunch of time, I remember you saying you don't like to spend much time on your food. I mean, you've got Ayurvedic cookbooks out, but you say yourself you don't like to spend too much time on, cooking a meal. What kind of stuff do you do, and how do you make it quicker for people that haven't really got, much time on their hands, right?
Yeah. That's why I wrote the Everyday Ayurveda Cookbook. So if anyone's listening and you're like, you want to know, and that is what I eat, like everything in that book, it's just my food that I codified.
It's actually what you eat. Yeah.
What I eat,
okay.
So I learned all these principles in India, but then I was kind of like back and forth between there and the US. So learning how to make the foods in a Western country. So the recipes are not only using Indian ingredients, there's also like local ingredients like oats, So I think a lot of, the basis of an Ayurvedic diet is whole grains, like red rice or oat porridge. I mean, very simple, just simply like porridge is actually amazing. And they call it kanji, but it's just porridge, and you could put digestive spices in it. And I mean, you can eat that all the time. So porridge and dal, which is just using small beans, like mung beans and lentils. Those are the small ones. Adzuki beans for our macrobiotic friends. Those are also kind of a small size bean. The larger
the smaller is better, is it? Right.
Yeah, the larger it gets, the more air is
harder
present.
It is to digest.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, right. Okay, so kind of flatulence and this kind of difficulty and digestion going on, right? So the small beans, okay, right?
Yeah,
and generally, the reputation of Ayurveda is just cook things to shit, right? Like really like just cook that stuff. No raw, because people often say, it gets confused the same breath with raw stuff, right? Like eating raw, and I think Ayurveda doesn't like raw so much, right? Hard to digest.
Yeah. Again, back to that Agni principle, like the Rig Veda, the first text, the first thing it is a prayer to Agni, to fire. And so we introduce our food to fire before we eat it. That's what cooking is. That's the processing that we do, especially using a flame, like a gas stove would be preferable to an electric stove because there's actually a flame.
Yeah.
So the point there is it not only that we introduce the Agni principle to the food before it enters the body, but that it's softened. Hard, like raw food is very hard, and there's all this chewing, and the body has to break down these hard pieces. Whereas if you imagine like the digestive juice that's created in the stomach, that then goes into the small intestine for absorption. That is the stuff of life in Ayurveda. That is the ahara rasa. It's like the juice of life. And we want that to be fully digested and soft and smooth and not too sour or putrid, which would happen if we ate like too much fermented food or it sits in the gut too long.
Right. Yeah,
so all this talk about like cooking our food and trying not to like mix together raw things with cooked things and fruits with food, and then we'll use spices like cumin, coriander, fennel, turmeric. And all of that is to create this ahara rasa in the stomach that then actually circulates via the bloodstream and builds the tissues of the body. So the better that juice is, the better the whole body is, and the less likely we are to have any diseases be able to like get a foothold in these tissues because they're healthy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And what about food combining? Is there any principles? You say not combining fruits and food, which is an obvious idea, which unfortunately, again, I'm often failed to do, like after a meal. I know it's a terrible idea to eat fruit after a meal, but I just still often do it. But apart from the silly things like that, I mean, what about combining, in a positive sense, certain things, and especially, yes, a lot of people these days, you mentioned before, and it's true, are suffering digestive issues. How could one look at using these principles to build up a stronger digestive fire, Agni?
I think the main way we do that is through combinations of spices. Like that is how we strengthen the Agni. So the basic spice mixture that's sort of considered tridoshic, like everyone across the board could try, is just that cumin, coriander, fennel, turmeric. And some, like, in my book, I have those. I teach you how to sort of dry roast it and grind it, and then you put it in a bottle and you can sprinkle it, in all your food. And that sort of thing, even if you eat weird combinations, the mixture of spices actually helps harmonize in the gut.
It out. Okay.
Yeah,
right.
it's helpful. It's helpful,
Right.
Yeah, and it can be drank as a tea. You can make a tea out of those 4 spices. Just boil them, say a quart of water, a teaspoon of each spice. You boil for 10, 15 minutes, strain that, and sip it along with the meals. That kind of a thing will absolutely harmonize, so I call that damage control. So it's like you're sort of eating whatever you want, but then you have this tool also that you're using.
I was going to say that in a kind of, then I thought it was flippant. Yeah, can you just, and then eat whatever you want and use this as a kind of like as a catch-all to get out of it. I mean, what happens if you are suffering a little bit from having overindulged, or, you've been under the weather, whether it's COVID or monkeypox or whatever else is coming, what kind of principles can you use to kind of give yourself a booster,
Well, I mean, if one is overindulged, the best thing to do is to skip a meal or 2, So if something crazy happens, you eat a bunch of cheese and fruit.
Fast.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be some crazy thing where you
That's
drink
crazy
juice for a week.
In your world, is it? Right.
Yeah, cheese at night. Oh my God.
Yeah, yeah, cheese and fruit. Oh yeah, I better go home and fast for days. Yeah, you should see what I eat. Right, so a little bit of fasting you recommend, a little, as a cleansing tool if taken, I'm sure, sensibly.
And it's just a meal.
Do you do any fasting? Generally, on a regular basis. I was speaking to someone recently this guy Chris Chappell, who I'm interviewed recently. He was saying he was fasting 1 day a week. Every he's done this for 50 years. He worked out he'd kind of not eaten. He worked out he'd not eaten for like 7 years or something crazy like that.
Yeah. So I used to do that. I definitely used to do a day a week of fasting. For me, that's actually not a good idea. I don't have the kind of constitution that needs to fast. I'm too light as it is. So that was me sort of being like the hardcore yogi. And I did that for, 5 or 6 years, What I will do is I will just eat khichdi or kanji, which we talked about, like a porridge, a simple porridge with those digestive spices. I might just eat that for a day or a meal, instead of just continuing to eat what I normally eat when I don't feel well, So it's nice because you can just drop into these simple foods and not cause any imbalances by fasting at inappropriate times or inappropriate ways. For some people who have a heavier constitution, that would be very excellent, for them to not eat once a week would be ideal. Yeah, but it's not for everyone.
Unfortunately, it doesn't usually go that way, does it? It's like the people that are lighter, they always tell you, I'm doing a fast, and you look and go, that doesn't seem a good idea. And then vice versa. Some people, it's like, they don't think, well, you probably could, that would work well for you. And they're like, oh, no, I don't. I'm never going to do that.
Right. I know, because we gravitate, that's like baked into Ayurveda, that we gravitate towards the familiar. So light people gravitate towards light therapies that may not be helpful instead of the opposite.
Yes, exactly. So it's a kind of, I was a clever sojourn really into just a wrapping up in terms of the grandstand of the doshas how do they relate to our body, and why is it that those, as you said, you point out because you're a knowledgeable practitioner, that those doshas tend to draw us into exactly often what's not good for us, right? So a vata person will be attracted to the very things that actually aggravate that vata condition, bizarrely enough, right? It won't necessarily inherently seek that balance, And how do you know when you're going too far one way, and how do you bring that back, And I suppose, first of all, to qualify it, like, what are these doshas, and in the first place, right?
So we talked a bit about the 5 elements, right? And so those are the building blocks of a body. They compound into 3 pairs that do physiological functions. So vata is space and air. So it's very light and mobile. So it does all the movement processes in the body, which includes the mind, the digestion, the menstrual process, circulation. All this movement stuff is governed by vata. Pitta is a combination of fire and water, which is hot and moist. And so its main thing is transformation. So it's like your digestive fire and your enzymatic activity and your red blood, and also the intellect, like the intensity of the gray matter in the brain.
Right.
And then your kapha is the heavy, that's earth and water. So it's heavy and moist. So it's like the mucus, the synovial fluid, all of your membranes. And it's also that which kind of holds the homeostasis in the body, where pitta is breaking things apart, breaking things down, and vata is moving things around, getting rid of wastes and bringing things where they need to go. They all do jobs, right? But the reason that they're called doshas, dosha means that which is at fault or that which is faulty. And that's because, through the thousands of years of trial and error, the Ayurveda acharyas could see that anytime the body got into disease process, one of these 3 compounds was at fault. So they have a tendency to get out of balance, which usually means that their qualities become too much. So the vata is very light and cold, so one becomes too light due to things like inappropriate amount of fasting. Right. And then you're unable to sleep, you're drying out and your poop gets weird, and you're constipated, all these things are happening. With the pitta, it's usually too hot. They have a tendency towards inflammation and the loose stool, skin problems like rashes and acne and things like that.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And your kapha types are, it's naturally heavy, dense, moist, a little bit slow.
Mm-hmm.
And when that gets out of balance, people are going to have the weight gain and the stagnation, the difficulty getting going. That's where Ashtanga is a great practice naturally for kapha types, because it's like so mobile. So those 3 are, when one of them its qualities start to increase beyond what is natural for a person's body, that's when things get too hot, too cold, heavy. And then there's different sorts of problems that you can imagine, right, that happen when we do that. So that's where vata types are encouraged to eat foods that are warm and moist and oily. Your pitta types encouraged to eat things that are cool and calming. And your kapha types are the ones that can enjoy the sort of lighter and drier foods.
Can enjoy fasting and
exactly.
That's a kind of diplomatic way to say it, isn't it? We're going to enjoy just eating very light salads. It's kapha. I thought it was kapha. It's kapha, is it?
Well, there's no F sound really in Sanskrit.
Right.
But,
okay.
But when it moved over to the West, everybody's just said that. And it's kind of stuck.
Yeah,
it's just stuck. Right? Yeah. It's honestly, there's no right or wrong at this point. I hear people of all different sorts say whichever.
Say both. Right.
It seems like they're both fine. Yeah.
Right. Okay. We can move on from there and the Twinkies. So, in terms of the doshas, but basically we need them all. I mean, because there's this, I think there was this kind of like trend of a number of years ago, right? Like, everyone self-diagnosing, and the best one I think was like, I'm a pitta or I'm a pitta vata, or, that's the, Yeah, and it's kind of almost pejorative to say, "Oh, you're a kapha,"
Right.
No one wants to be a kapha,
I know.
right? Or but we actually need all these to be balanced, right? So you need to be a combination of all these things, right?
Right.
And I suppose, just to round this off with broad brushstrokes, how might we recognize our doshas, and how might we start to reconcile, ourselves to trying to create some kind of daily balance? You've talked about the food a lot, but would you perhaps round this off by just talking about other aspects of Ayurveda? Because it's always known about food, but as you mentioned at the start, Sharath Jois was talking in the Yoga Mala, kind of Ayurvedically, roughly speaking, I suppose, about avoiding busy places and and this kind of thing, overstimulation, right? Vata loves this stimulation. I'm a Vata. I think I love overstimulation, but it doesn't work well for me. There's all too much coffee, and then you're going out, and then this kind of thing, right? There's like there are other guidelines that we can bring into our life to kind of just try and regulate these kind of tendencies that we have to go towards extremes. I think we have a natural tendency to seek extremes, don't we?
Yeah. One of the things, this is a big place where yoga and Ayurveda overlap is in the sense organs. So one of the main causes of disease, according to Ayurveda, is aside from so there's 3 causes of disease: the seasonal changes. So that's why we have we change our food with the seasons. We drink hot water when it's cold out and cool water when it's hot, and the second cause of disease is misuse of the senses. So when the mind becomes attached to the sense object, so there's your yoga, right? And there is a care of the senses. That's how we avoid the overstimulation. So, we're aware of the stimulation of the eyes, the ears, the skin, the smell, and the tongue. So things like reducing fragrance, artificial fragrance. We scrape the tongue. We try to eat naturally tasting foods. We wash the eyes with rose water to keep them cool. And then there's the application of oil to the skin. Yeah, so the oil to the skin, that's a great one for your yoga people, because it is the most balancing to Vata, and it's also the kind of the number one longevity technique for all bodies. Like it says that the one who practices oil massage does not suffer from old age. That's where it goes into oil in the text.
Oh, well, they kind of say that about everything, don't they? But if you practice Mayurasana, you'll live forever and have superpowers.
Right.
But no,
true.
But seriously, what kind of people often ask that? Is that the same as the oil bath, the castor oil bath, or is it different to that? Is it just rubbing a different oil on your body every day? Can you explain that a bit further?
It's different. Yeah, you won't hear a lot in Ayurveda about castor oil bath. You will not hear that much. Castor oil is used. It's used externally, locally, and it's used internally in medicines, but not so much that's specific to people who are doing Ashtanga, I think, a very sort of heating and intense practice. For general, it's usually sesame oil. That's sort of the most Vata balancing. It's the densest and the warmest of the oils. So for people who run cold and are dry, that is an incredibly useful practice to apply the sesame oil to the skin before the shower. And then you take the shower, and that's that heating sort of moist principle that you add that to the oil. And you can just sort of like soap the hairy parts, but not necessarily soap off all the oil. Like I think allowing the skin to absorb it is good, So that kind of thing can be done
beforehand.
Ideally, yeah. Ideally, you can sort of like, sit around, do your pranayama or something with it on, 20, 30 minutes.
Right, just full of oil, just sitting there, just put a towel down or something. Don't sit in your mum's sofa. Something,
exactly.
Right. Right. So sesame oil before the shower, and castor oil, nothing to do with Ayurveda. Just apart from God knows, don't take it internally. All kinds of stuff happen.
Yeah.
But I think as a purgative, it is used, right? Right. So that's a great a great piece of advice. I always recommend people rubbing the oil on as well, just for the joints and
Yeah.
just general health of the body. Yeah.
Right. Which, just to say, for people who do run hot or have like hot skin things, they don't want to use sesame. They want to use probably coconut oil.
Okay.
Because that'll remove heat from the body.
Right. Yeah, I know that in India they put it on the head, don't they? Cooling.
Yes.
And put a little bit on the hair, and
right.
A couple of things. Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And any other little tips before we finish off this interview today? Any other little tips you use in your life that have really helped, or anything specific? I mean, the tongue scraping, I think, has been a revelation for many people. To be frank, I think that many people really swear by that. I remember Laruga talking about that for years ago, and I think I got one for a while. Also, oil pulling, I think that's popular. Is that Ayurvedic?
Yeah,
they bring the oil in the mouth and shrink. Right.
Yeah.
Anything else you can think of that people could include in their routines?
Again, not to harp on the food thing, but I honestly think that a lot of digestive disturbances, I see them healed by waiting to eat until the previous meal has been digested. So usually that's a good 4 hours. So I think a lot of people eat too often, and therefore that ahara rasa that is compromised. It's like you cook half your rice for 10 minutes and then you put the other half in and keep cooking. So half the rice is too sticky and half is raw,
That's a good metaphor. Yeah.
Okay. So I think that people who feel like gassy or bloated, or there's like just weird things going on with the digestion, to try spacing the meals out by about 4 hours. It's different for different people, different depending on the size of the meal, but in general, like sitting down and having food and then not eating again for a while. And then sitting down and having food. That's, I think, the beneficial way to take food.
So no snacks.
Yeah,
not too many snacks.
Not every day, not all the time.
Right. Okay. I mean, how? My last question, actually, but it came up earlier, but I didn't mention at the time. Is like, how rigorously do you stick to this? Does one need to stick to it? Do you know what I mean? I mean, people might think, well, Kate, she thinks that cheese and fruit is that's insane. That's a party, So I'm just going, there's no hope for me, right? I mean, that's her, like thinking that things are out of control. Then God knows what I can, what I can do with this. I mean, like how. How often do you break the rules and have a piece of cheesecake or a bit of fruit, God forbid?
Yeah. I think I have two answers to that. One is the 80-20 rule.
Yeah.
So you party down 20% of the time, and then the other,
hold the
other 80, you're trying to like be on your game. But I also have to say, like, if a person is very healthy and they're asymptomatic, like they feel like their digestion is good, their appetite is good, their skin is good, they feel good, they sleep well, everything's good, like then there's no need to freak out. Whatever you're doing is working,
Right.
But when, and I am in that place more often now due to 20 years of living this way. That first 10 years after all the sickness, I really was very careful, and now I can get away with all kinds of stuff. And I enjoy that, but I know like when to say when, and I'm like, oh, a little cheese and fruit at night, sometimes. Okay. You know what I mean? But it's not like my diet that I'm doing that all the time.
Yeah. Right.
So I can get away with a lot because I live well, and I know my body's signs and I listen to them. I think that's the ideal.
I think that's part of it as well, isn't it? Yeah. But also listening, because sometimes you kind of know, I know like certain things, eating watermelon after dinner is not a good idea. I mean, it's done in many countries, right? Like, you give the watermelon, right, in Greece a lot, and I got into this habit, it's in a warmer country, right? It's a terrible idea, and it doesn't affect me well at all, and often gives me stomach cramps even. But you still one does these things, it's crazy. Yeah. It's crazy.
Right.
When and so I think a lot of, I imagine a lot of it is, coming down to knowing what feels good, and doing what feels good. It sounds like such a simple instruction, but it's not always as easy as all that, which I suppose is makes it a deeper question in terms of the yoga and Ayurveda, much more widely and generally,
Yeah.
wanting and actively seeking feeling good, right? And knowing what that feels like even,
Absolutely. I was so in that place of not knowing any of that for myself. I didn't know what it felt like to be satisfied by a meal for a long time. I was, kind of scared of food. And I had to learn that, and there was a period of experimentation. Like I'll tell when I work with people on making diet changes in the way they eat, I'll say, give it 6 months. Give it 6 months and experiment and pay attention and expect it to take that long for one to learn, what feels good and what doesn't. And it can be a fun, sort of curious, natural experimentation that leads you to this place where you feel empowered because like what works and what doesn't. And it's up to you if you're going to eat the watermelon. It's your choice. You can suffer the consequences happily.
Yeah, that's the thing. Yeah. Just know, it's like I think Nancy Gilger said, one time, like, have the wine, but just practice the next day. Just do what you want, but practice it, and then make your choices. Which I think is a great piece of information, really, or advice, really, right? Like, it's like, don't deny yourself, but make sure you come up on the next day and do your yoga or whatever, and then make your choice after the the night out, and all the excess, right? Like, then decide whether like you weigh it up, right? Like, and that's what I suppose what I did in the end, really. It's kind of weigh up, like, is it worth those indulgences?
Right, exactly. Is it worth it? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And sometimes it is, to be frank, sometimes it is, and I'll hold my hand up and say, it was a rubbish practice, and that was all worth it. But most of the time, as you say, learning how and what feels good is a process, and it's emotional as well, and and I think it is really a huge part of our yoga practices, knowing how our body feels good and what that feels like for our body. So, thanks, Kate, for coming on. That's really a very informative little chat we've had, and I think people can find you at your website, which is Kate O'Donnell, I would assume, .com.
KateO'Donnell.yoga.
We'll put it in the Kate O'Donnell.yoga. Fair enough, makes sense, and. Right, we'll put it in the notes as well. And anything else coming up? I think you're doing something at Esalen, aren't you?
Kripalu. I teach at Kripalu a lot.
Kripalu, right? Okay.
On the East Coast.
Okay. There's two confused coming from.
Right. Yeah, we do have an online.
2 different coasts, right? Yeah.
It's an online program though, coming up June 1st. So people from anywhere could join. We're doing skin. We're talking about skin this time. Yeah. So, there's tons. I'm so always busy. I love working. So, yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks so much for coming on. And I hope you enjoyed it as much as me.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.